Allegedly, the Kremlin wants to mobilize 500,000 troops to Ukraine to make up for the lack of Russian progress there over this calendar year so far. It goes without saying that this would be an enormous political risk for Putin. He has backed away from that policy for almost 4 years now because of just how unpopular it was the last time that he tried it. But today, we need to explore a subtle political risk that no one is talking about. What happens to the welfare of those who stay behind? Obviously, anyone who gets sent to Ukraine will be furious. There will be plenty of domestic upheaval in reaching that point, as average Alexanders will try to scheme every which way to get out of serving. Friends and family of those deployed will also be angry, and their concerns will linger until the very special military operation comes to a close. However, assuming the Kremlin politically survives the mobilization process, the chief political concern will then return to how Russia's 75 million laborers feel about the general war situation. So far, the war has been a boon to them. The Russian Ministry of Defense has created an artificial demand surge for labor, both in terms of voluntary contracts for soldiers and factory workers who support military production. Real wages are up for the average Russian despite an unstable ruble and surging inflation. To summarize the war in a sentence, we have seen a massive cash transfer from Russian oligarchs to the Russian working class to further a Kremlin vanity project. Consequently, if mobilization will continue to help the Russian working class, then the Kremlin has a silver lining. If the security apparatus can get through the initial pain of mobilization, then the truly discontented folks will be on the front lines, too far away to pose a threat to Moscow. If not, then mobilization is a double whammy. Even if you can somehow force 500,000 men to Ukraine, you are still left with having to deal with a workforce also coming after you. So let's look past those sent to Ukraine and who are obviously worse off under this policy. Let's also ignore those that dodge the draft by leaving the country and heading to Turkey or elsewhere. Although they will have successfully avoided the meat grinder, they are also worse off than under the status quo. Otherwise, they would have departed Russia already. Instead, our only interest will be those left behind and still clocking in for their shifts. And stay with me here for a while, because our initial impressions will be deceiving, to the point where a fun side game for you to play is to spot the hidden assumption that sustains the whole theory. Actually, this story is still not getting the attention commensurate with how much it will dictate the future of the war. Where we last left this conversation, it was really only hitting specialized outlets. It has since expanded to a bit broader coverage, but we have not seen it proliferate to the mainstream outlets that would then allow the implications to receive the proper public scrutiny. I know about this deficit thanks to the returning sponsor of today's video, Ground News. I still like getting my daily briefing, daily, to make sure that I'm not missing out on anything, like the State Department using an absolutely horrible AI-generated map. Yikes, still more attention to this than the mobilization story. And then again, I, for one, have always looked forward to visiting the landlocked Ivory Coast. Meanwhile, by visiting ground.news/lines on maps, or by scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan, which grants you access to everything that you have seen here and more. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Okay, let's get to the financial question. Our baseline expectation, emphasis on baseline, for a Russian worker is that they will be better off as a consequence of the mobilization. The reason is basic supply and demand economics. There are fewer people around to do the same number of jobs as before. For employers to fill vacancies and stop their current employees from getting poached, they need to increase wages. Simple as that. You may already be familiar with this story from World War II, when a bunch of Americans sailed across the Pacific and Atlantic, and suddenly wages jumped for those who stayed behind. Or you can go back further to the Black Death, when even more people were dying, and labor used the short supply to get wage concessions from their employers. As for the extent of those wage increases, we have to switch to what might be best described as informed speculation. We can begin by thinking a bit more about what exactly is changing here. It is not just the 500,000 men leaving for Ukraine. We also need to account for more of the labor force leaving the country to avoid service. The last time this happened, when Russia only mobilized 300,000 men, approximately 300,000 to 700,000 more left the country. For the current situation, let's call it 500,000. This duplicates the mobilization number as the low end of the estimate, which compensates for how many who would plan to leave today having already left in 2022. Never mind that those soldiers mobilized need to be clothed, equipped, and armed. We might expect military production to expand to about half of the number mobilized to cover those needs, though we will circle back to the feasibility of that in a minute. Summing up, we get a gap of 1.25 million in the labor market against a total labor market of about 75 million. Now, under normal circumstances, a 1% shift in labor demand versus supply yields about a 0.3 to 0.4% increase in wages. A gap of 1.25 million versus a total labor force of 75 million is a 1.67% shift. So that yields total wage gains ranging from 0.5% to 0.67%. However, much of those gains would be fleeting, as over the long run, employers reduce equipment stocks to match the new status quo, and the economy overall contracts. Then again, Russia is not a normal place right now. We are talking about a 1.67% shift when unemployment is hovering just above 2%. And wage growth increases exponentially as you get closer to full employment. It would not be crazy to think that wages will rise 4 times as fast as they normally would, which corresponds to a 2% to 2.67% increase. And it would not be shocking to learn in 6 months that it was more. What should we make of this substantively? Using the lower end of the estimate, a 2% gain is the type of thing that workers will notice, even if it will not turn them into Kremlin loyalists. One thing to keep in mind here is that the Russian workforce is concentrated on the lower end of the income spectrum. Someone making $50,000 in the United States might not internalize an extra $1,000 of income all that much. Yes, it might be nice to pay down some debt or add to a retirement account. It is just not likely to be a make or break difference. But if you are Russian and making 5,000 rubles per year, even that extra 100 might be the difference between everyone in your family eating and someone going hungry. Thus, I would describe those remaining at home to be content with this part of the situation, given the lower end of the estimate. Things get more interesting if we are vastly underestimating the effect here. Real wages have grown closer to 5% annually since the start of the war. However, it is hard to adjudicate what portion of that effect is due to the narrowing supply of labor and the now built-in demand shock from the war economy, and lingering effects from the end of the pandemic. If the actual change for 2026 is twice that, 10%, then you will start to have some very happy people at home. Now, if you work in the Kremlin, everything that you have heard so far might leave you pretty excited. You can pay one cost, and then you can have your cake and eat it too. That is, if you can survive the political turbulence of the initial mobilization, you get the coercive power on the battlefield against Ukraine. Plus you have marginally 2 very happy laborers at home. But now it is time to crash the party. Remember how I said that there was a hidden assumption driving everything that I said earlier? Did you spot it? 3 things have driven the wage gains for Russian workers thus far. 1. The reduction of the workforce due to everyone deployed in Ukraine. 2. The increase in war-related job demand at home. And 3. The Ministry of Defense contracts that were necessary to sustain the first part. But think about what will happen if the Kremlin decides to mobilize. The whole point of forcing 500,000 troops to go to Ukraine is so that the Kremlin does not have to pay them market wages. That being the case, what one would expect to happen is that the Kremlin will drop the contract offers as soon as the mobilization orders are signed. Or maybe they will drop to an amount small enough that they do not matter anymore for this equation. Basically, the bare minimum to nab the most ideologically inclined of Russian citizens. Regardless, it is hard to imagine that the same wage pressures will survive the new deployment scheme. As it stands currently, Russia signs an estimated 30,000 soldiers per month, or 360,000 per year. That creates enormous upward pressures on every other employer in the country. And further note that these wages have kept increasing over time for Ministry of Defense contracts. In other words, in 2 months, it is possible that the most fiscally rewarding outside option for Russian workers will disappear overnight, and that portion of the wage pressure equation drops to summer 2022 levels. And so now we have to play a game of whether the lower supply of workers for civilian jobs dominates the effect of the vanishing Ministry of Defense contracts. Unfortunately, that is not something that I can provide a clear answer to. It is certainly the type of thing that Russian economists would want to use private data to try to estimate. And getting that answer right in this context is of grave importance. It may be the difference between whether a policy of mobilization comes with a silver lining for Putin, or if it is a double shot of disaster. Just imagine the Kremlin trying to sort out the public resistance to sending troops over there in the first place, immediately followed by Russian workers suddenly finding themselves noticeably poorer. One thing that casual war observers do not understand is that the Kremlin has politically sustained the war in part due to the average Russian benefiting from it. Again, it is a large cash transfer from Russian oligarchs to the Russian working class for the benefit of a Kremlin vanity project. It would be quite the bold political play to sweep that from right under their feet, just as Ukraine is causing great headaches with Russia's gasoline supply and e-commerce industry. Another point to add here is that part of what ought to sustain wages is how the mobilized soldiers will require equipment. Thus, the extra demand for jobs at home might compensate for the Ministry of Defense contracts disappearing. Whether that happens depends on the availability of Russian capital. You cannot produce more equipment without the machines to do so. If instead, the only machines that you will have are already sitting there, what you end up getting is the same level of equipment produced, but distributed across a whole bunch more humans. And if there is only little room for expansion at existing factories, even then most of the gains will be accrued by existing employees taking overtime shifts, rather than diffuse benefits to the wider labor market. The end result here is that the average Russian will still be better off as compared to the counterfactual, where there was no war whatsoever. But that is already baked into how Russian citizens feel about the war. And what will happen, assuming that the disappearing contract effect dominates, is a bunch of workers suddenly feeling poorer. And I should end by noting that none of this considers the random effects of mobilizing rather than using the economically efficient system of contracts. Some jobs are complementary, meaning that my presence enhances your productivity gains, and vice versa. For example, if I am an expert in crisis bargaining theory, and you are knowledgeable in the subject, plus an expert in video production, then you and I make each other better for the end production of a video. The problem arises when mobilization randomly sends you to the front lines. I make less money as a consequence of the labor force having shrunk. The reason that this does not happen in a voluntary contract system is that the individuals with complementary capabilities receive wage premiums from their employers precisely because the associated business stream is like a house of cards. Our employer really needs to keep both of us here to maintain the gravy train. And the way that employers do that is by paying us more. In addition to whichever way the tug of war of fewer Russians in the labor market and missing Ministry of Defense contracts goes, this will absolutely have a negative effect on wages. Again, how all of this will pan out for Russia is difficult for us to see from the outside. Heck, it is still hard to predict even if you are on the inside. That is why if the Kremlin indeed follows through on its alleged mobilization plans in September, we will be looking at the highest leverage domestic political situation for Russia since the fall of 2022. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a fantastic 40% off a Vantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.